Welcome back to Solo Adventures! My name is Livy and I'm here today to talk about Dungeon Flea, the Final Retail Deluxe Edition. So first off, you might notice that I look a little bit nicer than from the last video, and that's because I finally got my camera settings figured out. My last video had better quality than my videos before that, but this should look even nicer because it really took me this long to figure it out. Okay, so if you've been around my channel for a while, you might remember that Dungeon Flea is the game that I chose as the #1 best out of the solo PnP contest on BGG a couple months ago. And this is the Final Deluxe Retail Edition. The game is still free to print and play, I believe, but this is the fancy boxed version for those of us who want to have a really nice, durable, packaged version of this game. In preparation for this video, I've played this game probably more than 10 times, no joke. So I think I have a better perspective on the gameplay than I did even during the contest, and a couple of things have changed. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the gameplay, first let's take a look at the box and the components so you can see what you get inside. So since Dungeon Flea is a game that you can print off and play for free if you, of course, just build the game yourself, if you're buying this edition of the game, it's either because you want the deluxe components or because you don't particularly feel like making your own copy of the game. So here's the box. Everything fits neatly inside here. Except for this mat, this is an additional purchase. This does not fit in this box, and this does not come standard with the game, so you'll have to buy it separately if you want it. But yes, here's the box. Pretty compact. And in the box we have a manual. Pretty standard sort of little booklet. Something that's neat, and I think might even be exclusive to this version, is this neat reference card that has some cool artwork of presumably the village that your adventurer is from on the back. And this just gives you kind of a rundown of the different actions that you can take with the cards, and it's just a nice little reference. One of the things that was not present in the original solo contest version of this game was the various characters that you can play as. Now, this is very cool. There are both male and female artwork versions of every class. The stats aren't different, the art is just different, and that's very cool. So you can play as the fighter, or the cleric, barbarian, the wizard, and the thief. The fighter is just your standard class in this game, and so it doesn't have any additional ability cards that need to explain what it can do. But all of the classes do have special abilities, and the cards are reversible, so you can switch it around to the side that best represents your character. And of course, the bulk of the box is taken up by this huge fat stack of cards. Now, these are quite nice full color cards, and they have a linen finish. They're very snappy and extremely durable. I have shuffled this particular deck of cards just countless times, and they still look really fresh and new. They're slippery, not too slippery. The cards definitely feel very deluxe, and I have no complaints there. So let's talk a little bit more about these kind of extra things that we have going on. So as I said, we have different classes. So this is where we can set our character in the middle of the board here. The mat is of course completely optional, but I think it really adds to the atmosphere and the fun of this game. So I'll just show you kind of how you set it up. We have our character in the middle, and if you have an ability, you can put your character ability card over here. So these three pieces are quite small, but they're pretty important to the game. So you have two options for tracking your hero's health. You have this little cube that you can just move around to track the health. Or there's this spiffy little clip that you can just slide on, and you can just kind of slide it up and down, and it doesn't fall off or anything. It's very nice. Whichever one you choose works really well. And then we have this Meeple. So one of the things that's shifted a little bit from the original contest version is it used to be that you would take your character card and you would move it from stack to stack around the dungeon. I didn't like doing that because my little cube would fall off. I guess now if you wanted to do it that way, you could just use it with a clip and that solves the problem. But in my gameplay video, I did use a little red pawn to move between the various corridors. So I don't know if this inclusion of the Meeple was inspired by my video, but in any case, I definitely think this is a better system for tracking where you are. And you can just use this to show which of the corridors that you're in. They're numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Your dungeon corridors are going to be set up here, your draw deck and your discard pile over here, and there's the banish pile. So everything is very neat and very organized. There's this little area here that's only for extreme mode, so this is for the exit path. And this is either where you can put your cards as they move into play, or I also put my magic items here sometimes. So let's take a slightly closer look at this mat. On this particular one, we have a picture of the monster door from the game. And I think it looks really cool with the this hand coming out to grasp at our adventurers. But I believe there are a few different types that you can choose from. So if this particular design doesn't really speak to you, there's a couple of different ones. The mat is kind of thin, but it doesn't really need to be that thick. Actually, I think maybe the thinness is better because it makes it more lightweight. The texture of the mat is a little bit scratchy. It doesn't really feel like a mouse pad. I don't really know if you can tell from that, but it just has a little bit of a texture to it. It's nothing bad. It doesn't feel bad or anything. It feels perfectly fine. The colors look pretty good. Everything looks pretty sharp here, and I don't really have any complaints about this. The mat cannot really be easily folded though. I wouldn't recommend doing that because that'll leave creases. So I always just roll it up like this and store it with a rubber band. Of course, this takes up a little bit more space, but for me it's completely worth it because I play this game enough. But for you, you might have to ask yourself if you're going to be playing this game enough to warrant having this larger playmat too. So yeah, those are the components. Let's get into talking about some of my thoughts about this deluxified version. So that's what you get in the box. I'm just going to give a couple of thoughts about how I feel about the build quality and the aesthetics of this game. So as I said before, I think the quality of this version is extremely nice. As far as I know, this game is only available right now at the Game Crafter, and so if you're familiar with the Game Crafter's linen finish cards, then you're probably going to have a pretty good idea of what these are like. But yeah, really nice, really high quality cards. The Meeple and the cube are both made of wood. The little slider clip grips on just hard enough, but not too hard to damage the card. No complaints whatsoever with the build quality. The box is nice, small, compact. It's really sturdy. It looks pretty much like something that you would buy from a game shop. So yeah, really nice professional looking package here. I really enjoy the actual aesthetic of Dungeon Flee. It's colorful without being garish. I don't really know how to explain that any better. A lot of dungeon crawler type games have kind of a gray, black, and brown sort of color palette. I really like that this one has some more reds and purples and yellows that pop out at you. It keeps things interesting and it really draws the eye, but at the same time it doesn't look like a rainbow explosion like, I don't know, World of Warcraft or something. Yeah, so really big fan of the aesthetic. The monsters look good, the characters look good, the artwork is very nice. In fact, the artwork for this game is miles better than the artwork for another one of the games that I reviewed from this designer, Zombie Solitaire. I criticized that game's artwork a little bit. It wasn't terrible. It really wasn't very great though, but I think this is quite nice, and I think that this is especially very pretty for a little indie game. So a few things have been changed and cleaned up about this game, especially in the rulebook. Some typos have been fixed, a few things have been better clarified here and there, but the biggest changes in this edition from the original contest version mainly comes down to the modes and also the character classes. As I said, there are all of these different classes you can choose. There's artwork for both male and female heroes. There's no mechanical difference, but it's just nice. I appreciate these little touches of attention to detail. Alright, so I'm going to go into the classes and I'm going to talk about them from the easiest to play to the most difficult, at least in my opinion. So the easiest class to play, I believe, is the cleric, and that's because the cleric can use an ability to heal him or herself. You just need to play 2 swords, and then you remove 1 point of damage from your health. So even though it can get rather tight in the combat, you might not have a lot of extra swords and shields lying around. When you do have those extra cards, it's extremely nice because you can just slowly fill your health back up to full. I think the cleric is the easiest for this reason. The next easiest, I would say, is the thief, and that's because the thief has this ability called the Thieves' Defense. This allows the thief to block 1 point of damage with just 1 shield. So normally you have to use 2 shields to block 1 point of damage. You can only use this ability twice per round, but you can of course block normally after that. But the thief can avoid a lot of damage, which in the end leads to a lot of survivability for this character. The next most difficult, I would have to say, I think, is the fighter. That's pretty much in between, and that's fitting. So in my opinion, there's 2 classes that are easier than the fighter and 2 that are harder. The next hardest one after the fighter, I would say, is the wizard. Now, the wizard has a really neat ability called the Grand Illusion. So anytime in a turn, you can change a sword to a shield or a shield to a sword up to 2 times in a round. So this means that you will much more often have exactly the cards that you need to take down whatever monster you're fighting. The catch with the wizard is that you are very low in health. You really have to be careful to not take damage because the wizard can go down pretty fast. I think this class is pretty tricky to play. But the very hardest, in my opinion, has to go to the Barbarian. Now, the Barbarian has a hefty 24 hit points, the highest of any character in this game. But the problem is that the Barbarian's ability isn't so much an ability as it is kind of a handicap. So the Barbarian is afraid of magic. The Barbarian will not pick up any treasure items, and that includes healing potions. So the Ring of Power and the Amulet of Death, all these extremely useful items that come in handy, especially later in the game, you will not be able to use as the Barbarian. In addition, not having access to healing potions is a huge hindrance in this game. I have not been able to win as the Barbarian. I do think that it's possible, but it's really, really hard. And speaking of things that are difficult, there are, of course, the new game modes. So what used to be the default game mode in the original contest prototype version is now easy mode. So that mode involves the more complicated setup where you arrange the cards in such a way that the more difficult monsters are deeper within the dungeon and the easier monsters are closer to the top, so you have a much kind of smoother progression with difficulty. The hard mode still sort of has this idea, but instead of putting the level 7 monsters on the very bottom, and then the 6 and the 5 and the 4, what it is monsters levels 1 through 3 are in one deck, and monsters level 4 through 7 are in the other, and you shuffle them independently and put the larger monsters on the bottom. So that means that while technically the easier monsters are, still near the beginning of the game, still closer to the surface, it is possible that you could run into a level 3 encounter on your first turn. This changes the difficulty drastically, especially when you don't have a lot of cards at the beginning and you take damage from the monsters pretty heavily. But other than this setup, hard mode also has an additional twist. So in normal difficulty, you may flee from the corridor that you are currently in whenever you want to, basically. So if you go down a corridor and you flip over a card, you have to fight the monster once you flip over the card. But after you finish fighting that monster, you might say to yourself, okay, I think that things are getting a little bit difficult, it's time to move to another corridor. In hard mode, you have to keep playing in the same corridor until you lose an encounter. So in order to change corridors, that means that you have to fail, and you will most likely lose health before you can actually change to another corridor. So that adds another level of difficulty there. Hard mode is just like easy mode in that to win you need to find the 4 steps that lead up. There are 2 blocked passages, so it's possible that you wasted your time going down one corridor. But in this mode you can be extremely lucky, and maybe you don't even have to beat all of the monsters in 2 of the corridors if you are just lucky enough to choose the corridors with the stairs up at the end. This is not the case in extreme mode though. So extreme mode has several differences. One of them is that it is definitely the easiest one to set up. So in order to set up extreme mode, literally all you do is you take out your starter sword and shield cards and set those aside, and you just shuffle the whole deck. You don't put the treasures in any particular order, you don't at all order the monsters in any particular order, the doors are everywhere, the empty corridors are everywhere, it's just completely random. So that means that it's completely possible that on your first turn you meet the Lich King. It's pretty obvious why this game is called extreme mode, because it does have pretty extreme difficulty spikes. So normally in Dungeon Flee, when you fight a monster and you fail to beat it, it stays in the corridor and you can go back and fight it again. But in extreme mode, if you fail against a monster, it gets put down at the bottom of the stack again. The blocked passages and the stairs up are not at the bottom of the dungeon corridor stacks. They're kind of in a little separate stack over to the side, and so you draw one off the top when you finally defeat all of the dangers in one corridor. So that means that in order to get to the end of that corridor, you do have to fight that Minotaur, you do have to fight that ogre, or whatever it was that was giving you a hard time. Extreme mode is tricky, it is really hard, but honestly it's one of my favorite ways to play, just because I love being surprised by what just pops up. I die a lot on extreme mode, but I'm okay with that. I really like difficult solo games, so yeah, after you've given easy and hard mode a try, don't be scared, just try out extreme, and maybe you'll like it too. So a lot of my overall thoughts about this game are going to be the same as they were in my first review for this, when the game was just a prototype for the solo PnP contest. I will put that link in the description box so you can see what my thoughts are there and I don't have to repeat myself too much. But yeah, I did play Dungeon Flee quite a few times before I reviewed it for that review. But of course now I have played it many, many more times, and I feel like I'm a lot more familiar with the game and how it plays now. That said, I still really like this game. Dungeon Flee is not incredibly deep or incredibly complicated. It doesn't have the deepest strategic decisions to make, but I personally really enjoy that in a game. I like the more casual sort of feel. From a strategic perspective, from the decision-making sort of perspective, I would compare this to about like one deck dungeon. You can make choices about the rooms that you want to go in and which monsters you want to fight and which ones you want to avoid, but there's always going to be luck that's going to be at the core of whether you defeat the monsters or not. In Dungeon Flee there are deck building elements, but they are quite simplistic. So basically what it comes down to is get all of the good cards into your deck and then try to figure out how to most efficiently get rid of the wasted empty corridor cards and your weak sword and shield cards. And you'll have to make the decision sometimes about whether it's better to take damage and be able to get rid of one of those corridor cards, or whether you just want to hang on to every health point that you can. One of my biggest criticisms for Dungeon Flea was the lengthy setup, and this has been helped a little bit by the different modes. Basically, the easier the mode that you want to play, the longer the setup is going to be. It's really not too bad, it's not too complicated. I can set it up now by memory without having to look at the rulebook, but it does take a little bit getting used to, and it does take a little bit longer to set up than what you might expect for a card game. The survival rate will vary greatly depending on the character class that you choose and also the difficulty mode that you choose. And these difficulties vary widely. Like, for example, if I choose to play as the cleric and I play in easy mode, I can almost guarantee that I am going to be able to beat this game. But if I play as a barbarian in extreme mode, I think that's going to be nearly impossible. Difficulty is going to be relative based on the players, so it's probably going to take a little bit of time for you to get the feel for what the right settings for this game are for you. And that might frustrate people a little bit because straight out of the box Dungeon Flea might be way too easy or way too hard, but play it a couple of times and I think you'll get a good feel for what options you want to have in the game. I would recommend Dungeon Flea for people who don't mind a bit of randomness, monsters suddenly popping up that you just can't deal with, doing crazy amounts of damage to you, and there's really not that much that you can do to help that. I would not recommend Dungeon Flea for people who don't like randomness in their games. I also would not recommend Dungeon Flea for people who require very deep, very strategic gameplay. The flow of Dungeon Flea is quite simple, and to me it's very relaxing, and I really enjoy the feeling of progression as my deck gets better and better. But if that doesn't sound fun to you, I don't know if Dungeon Flea is a game that I would recommend. Dungeon Flea is a game that's light on rules, but can be brutally difficult, so that may or may not appeal to you. For me personally, this is exactly the kind of game that I like to take out and just play casually. It doesn't take up too much of my brain space. The box is nice and small, I can take it with me anywhere. It takes just under an hour, so for me that's about the perfect amount of time for a game like this, and it's got a really nice, relaxing sort of flow to it. I have played this game, as I said before, more than 10 times in preparation for this review, and I will not hesitate to say that I will play this game many, many dozens of times more, and I really just like it that much. Dungeon Flea is not any kind of groundbreaking game. It's not going to completely change the way that you look at board games. There's nothing just mind-blowing about any of the mechanics here. It's just a game that really jives really well with me. So I don't want to give you kind of a false sense of hype for this game if the gameplay doesn't look like it would appeal to you. I think a very specific kind of gamer would like this game, and I wouldn't recommend it for everyone. But yeah, in any case, as I said before, Dungeon Flea was probably one of my very favorite games that I discovered in the year 2020, and I still stand by that. It has earned its place in my regular rotation right alongside Friday and Onirim. It's kind of a toss-up between these three, which one I'll choose if I want just a quick game. So now the question comes down to, do you want to buy the retail deluxe version of this game? And that I really can't answer for you. If I were you, what I would do is I would make the print and play version of this game and try it out. And if you like it, absolutely spring for this retail version. Dungeon Flea is a little bit like Onirim in that you have to shuffle a lot. When you play your cards from your hand and they go into the discard pile and you run out of cards to play, you have to shuffle them up again. And especially at the beginning, that can be every couple of rounds. It gets to be a lot of shuffling. My homemade P&P cards are sturdy, but they're not the best for shuffling, and they don't hold up the best over time. If you're serious about Dungeon Flea and want to play it a lot, get this Game Crafter version because the cards seem to be practically indestructible at this point. They've really held up well over many, many plays, and they're extremely resistant to damage no matter how much I shuffle these. This is a game with hidden information, so You never know what card is coming up next, if it's going to be just a little goblin or it's going to be the Lich King. So you want cards that are not going to be too easily damaged so you don't accidentally spoil what's down that corridor before you flip the card. Aside from the durability, I think that this box version is just really nice. Having a little wooden meeple, and the neat little clip, and all of these character cards already just nicely made for you. It's a good package, and it fits really nicely in a small box. So yeah, if you like Dungeon Flee, if you've tried it out, or at the very least if you've watched some gameplay, then buy this retail version. It's on the Game Crafter, and in my opinion, it's awesome. If you want to have a super fancy experience, also go for the game mat. I personally will not play without it now. The game is still perfectly fine without the game mat, but I think it just adds so much to the atmosphere. It keeps everything looking really organized. But yeah, if Dungeon Flee is one of your most played games, like it is for me, then I would absolutely spring for the playmat. I think it's totally worth it. So if you like simple card-based dungeon crawler deck builders with mechanics that are not crazy complex, then you might well like Dungeon Flee, and I suggest you give it a try. So I forgot to mention at the beginning of this video that I did get this copy as a gift from the designer, but I don't have a problem with being critical of games that were gifted to me, so make of that what you will. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, then please leave it a like, and if you really like what I do here, then please subscribe. I want to give a special thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon. They're super awesome people, but I want to give an extra special big thanks to my heroic tier patron, Joshua Jumbles. So until next time, friends, stay adventurous.